Hello and welcome to English 203, Introduction to Literary Study. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and this is the week one lecture. So we have a few things to get to today. I would like to cover the typical first day stuff, introducing the class, taking a look at our syllabus, looking at the course modules in Canvas, that sort of thing. We'll keep it brief, and then we can move into our actual week one material. So we can talk more about what literature is, how we're going to study it in this class, and some of the techniques and strategies that we'll be learning about. But let's just start with some basics. If you can log into Canvas, try to go to our week one module. Let's just make sure that this is working for everyone. If you're having any issues with your password or accessing Canvas in any way, you need to get in touch with computer services at GBC. I'm not really the person to ask about that sort of thing. I am not tech support, but we have a good tech support group at GBC. They can help. You can email them, you can call them. I'm happy to give you their number, but you can also just find it on the GBC website. But if you're having any issues with Canvas or your email, your GBC email, you need to get all of that ironed out right away because this is an online class, obviously, so we are going to be heavily reliant on Canvas. And also your email. I mean, I'm happy to correspond with you using your own personal email. If that's what you send me emails from, I will respond. But sometimes I will send out class-wide emails to everybody in class, and I do that through Canvas. So when I do that, I'm sending the email to everyone's GBC email account. So you need to make sure you can access that. Try to check it regularly. And obviously, you need access to Canvas if you want to do any online coursework at GBC. So if you're having issues, get those addressed as soon as possible and let me know if you're having trouble, if you can't get a hold of computer services or whatever. I'm happy to help any way I can, but I'm not much for tech troubleshooting. So if you're in Canvas, go to our week one module and you'll see everything that you need for the week in the module. And this is what I like to do at the beginning of each week. So each Monday morning, I will post that week's module and you'll find everything that you need for the week inside that module. So that includes these lecture videos. You can always find these videos in the weekly modules, but you can also find them on YouTube just by searching my name. You can also find an overview for the week. That's almost like written notes, kind of a general summary of what we are covering that week. So it's similar in terms of content to what I'm talking about in these videos. So I'm giving you the information both in spoken form here in the lecture videos and also in written form in the overviews. You can find the reading assignments for each week. You can find the written assignments, which will normally be our discussion posts. So the prompts for those discussion posts will always be available along with whatever it is we are reading that week. It'll normally be a chapter from our book. But all of that information is easy to find. It's always there in the weekly modules. So if you're having any trouble locating any of that stuff, just let me know. Also, in the week one module, you can find the syllabus. Now, I recommend saving that, downloading that, or maybe even printing it. You don't need to read it word for word right away, but it is a good document to keep handy. All of my policies are there. My contact info is there. So if you look on page one of the syllabus, you'll find my name. You'll find my email, the best way to contact me. Also, my office hours. Those are virtual office hours now, but I'm always available to talk during those times, and we can talk however you want. We can exchange emails. I can set up a video call through Zoom or something like Google Meets. We can even do a telephone call, I suppose, if you really want to. But one of those methods should work for all of us. So I always respond to emails, at least within about a 24-hour period. But if you want to do a video call, try to shoot for my office hours. If those hours don't work for you, my schedule is pretty flexible, so we can probably find another time to meet. But I am available, and I'm always happy to meet with you guys and talk more. But typically, as we know, in an online class, most communication takes place through email. So that's fine too. Let's see, what else? You can kind of peruse my class policies at your leisure. You don't necessarily have to do that right away. But if you ever have questions about my late work policy or my revision policy or my attendance policy, all of that info is there in the syllabus. You can also find a list of all of our assignments, all of the things we're going to be working on this semester. You can find point values for those assignments along with the overall grading scale. So, good info to have, good info to check from time to time. But the most important part of the syllabus, I think, is the detailed class schedule that you can find near the end of the syllabus. It's like the final 2 or 3 pages of the document. So if nothing else, you should check out the class schedule because I'm showing you everything that we are doing this semester on a week to week basis. So you can see what we are covering each week. You can see all of the due dates when all of our written assignments are due. You can see where all of the reading assignments occur. It's just a good thing, again, to keep handy in case you want to check, take a look. Keep in mind that in Canvas, I only publish the modules 1 week at a time. So if you want to look ahead, if you want to work ahead, maybe get a jump start on some future assignments, using that class schedule in the syllabus is really your best bet. Take a look at what's coming up and you can get a jump start. Or if you're going to miss time, if you're going to be away from your studies for a while, maybe, out of town, attending the family business, you can also get a jump start. Or conversely, if you are sick, if something happens that takes you away from your studies unexpectedly and you're trying to catch up later, you can always go back and see what you missed by referring to the class schedule. But of course, you can also email me and I'm happy to help. So the schedule is just a nice thing to have close at hand. So if you have any questions about anything on the syllabus, let me know. Also, on page 1, if you go back, there's info about the required book. So we only have one textbook for this class. It's called A Handbook of Critical Approaches to Literature. You want the 6th edition. Make sure you get the 6th edition and not an earlier or later edition, which will be a little bit different. Okay, I want everybody to have the 6th edition, and all the info about the book can be found on page 1 of the syllabus. The title, the edition, and the ISBN number, which you might want to double check when you're ordering the book just to make sure that you're getting the right one. The book is available through the GBC bookstore. If you don't want to go through the GBC bookstore, that's fine. You can find used copies of this book very easily online. Just search for it. Tons of online booksellers have it, so it really shouldn't be difficult to find and order. I'm hoping everybody has the book by the end of week 1 at the latest. I know sometimes we can experience some delays. The book might take a little bit longer than we think to arrive, and that's okay. If you don't have the book here at the very start of week 1, that's not a huge deal, but hopefully you'll have it by Wednesday, Thursday, or at least Friday, because we do have our first reading assignment due by the end of the week and our first discussion post. Most weeks we will have a discussion post, so we have our first one this week. They are normally just going to be opportunities for you to respond to what we read and for you to kind of work through the concepts and techniques that we're learning about on a week-to-week basis. So those discussion posts are pretty informal, pretty short. They're conversational. You guys can talk to each other, answer questions, see each other's posts, respond if you want. And every once in a while, I might even jump on there and we can talk that way. So you'll need the book in order to complete the first reading and the first discussion post. So if we're getting near the end of the week and the book has still not arrived yet, get in touch with me, email me, and we can work something out. I'm happy to make some PDF versions of these early chapters in the book for those of us who don't have the book yet. I'm not going to do that for the entire class because that feels unnecessary, but if a couple of individuals need PDFs, I can provide those PDFs. You just need to ask me. All right, and you can do that by email by the end of week 1 if you're getting alarmed. And we can be flexible here at the start of the semester. I can give you a little bit of an extension if you need some extra time to complete the week 1 assignments. Just let me know. And that's always the rule. In a class like this, if you guys have questions, problems, concerns, if you need an extension on an assignment, if you're going to be away from class for a while, whatever, just reach out and talk to me. That's always the best answer. That's always the best approach. If you need anything, if you're concerned about anything, just email me. Let's talk. Let's work it out. We can usually solve most problems that way. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about as far as the syllabus goes. If you guys have any questions about it, just let me know. Otherwise, we will move on. Let's talk a little bit more about literature, and let's talk more about what we are going to be doing in this class. So most of you have some experience with literature. Whether you like it or not, you've had to read it before. And a lot of our experiences with lit occur in the academic world, in school, in the school setting, whether it was high school, middle school. I mean, in some cases, we have our earliest exposure to literature as early as elementary school. So we know generally what literature is, although we can complicate that definition a little bit later because it is a difficult term to define, but we have a general idea of what it is. We've experienced it before, we've read it before, but as they point out in the first chapter of the book, a lot of students have negative experiences with literature. And they definitely have negative experiences to the idea of taking a critical approach to literature. And a lot of this does have to do with school and the fact that our exposure to literature is often in the academic context where it's work. It's an assignment. It's something that you have to do, not necessarily something that you want to do. And something that often makes students apprehensive and perhaps, just makes them have a bad time is the idea that we're supposed to know what literature means. What does it say? What does it mean? What is the significance? That's really what it is to interpret literature, right? To interpret literature is to try to uncover the meaning, to try to uncover the purpose, the significance of the literature. And that can often be difficult. And when we're doing it in a class setting, when we're doing it as an assignment, it often becomes a rather unpleasant thing because we become convinced that there's just one right answer to this, interpretive journey that we're on. This work of literature, it means one thing, and I have to figure out what that one thing is. And if I don't, I have failed. I have, done a bad job, and I feel bad. That's often how the experience goes for a lot of us. questions, right? And literature ends up becoming something almost like math or science, where there's one answer, one correct answer that we're trying to uncover. And if we don't get there, we feel like we've come up short or we're deficient in some way. So I want us to kind of break some of those old habits if possible. I want us to break free from maybe some of those older ways of dealing with literature. And I might be wrong. Perhaps you guys have had really good experiences with literature. Maybe you've had some great teachers in middle school and high school who really taught you the love of reading and got you into the text that you read. And that's great. That makes everything go a little bit more smoothly. And maybe some of us like to read outside of school. Maybe we like literature. We just enjoy it. It's a hobby, and we've always done it both in school and outside of school. And if that's true for you, that's great. I don't have to convince you so much. But I do find that a lot of students, even students who do have a love for reading or writing or any kind of creative expression, they've sometimes had some fear instilled in them at some point when it comes to literature, or they've been unsure, they've been uncertain. I'm not really sure what this means. I don't know if I'm really interpreting this correctly. I hear that all the time in my college literature classes. So it's something that college students definitely struggle with throughout their academic careers. So I want us to kind of demystify literature a little bit. I want us to realize that we are all fully capable of interpreting it, understanding it, doing interesting work with it. We're all ready to do it. We just need some practice. We just need to learn some techniques, some strategies. We need to do some reading. We need to do some practice, and we can all get where we want to go in this class. So what are we really trying to do in this class aside from just gaining a greater appreciation for literature? And I definitely hope that does happen. But what else are we trying to accomplish? Well, the name of the class is Introduction to Literary Study. So what does it mean to really study literature? What does that involve? What all are we doing when we study literature? Well, we've already talked about some of it. We are interpreting literature. We are trying to determine what a particular work of literature means. Now, that can be a very difficult endeavor. So you shouldn't feel bad if it is difficult for you to try to uncover the meaning. Often there are multiple potential meanings, and different readers will pick up on different meanings. See, that makes literature and the reading and the studying of literature a lot more subjective than other academic disciplines like math or like chemistry, right? With those types of disciplines, typically there's one right answer or like a range of answers. And if you don't land in that right area, you are kind of wrong and you got the thing wrong, right? That's just how those disciplines work. But that's not how literature works, and that's not how literary study works. When we're studying literature, we have to understand that the experience of reading literature is subjective, which means it will vary widely from person to person. My experience reading a novel will be very different from your experience reading that same novel. We're reading the same literature, but we are different people. We have different backgrounds. We have different personalities. We have different lifestyles. We have different worldviews, different opinions, different ways of feeling and seeing the world. Well, I guess I already said that with worldview. So we're different, right? Everybody's different. So our own personal experiences and backgrounds and personalities will have a big impact on how we read stuff. So the meaning that I pull out of that novel might be different than the reading that you pull out of it. That doesn't make you wrong or me wrong. That just makes us different readers. And we have different priorities. We have different values, perhaps. Or we just were more interested in different parts of the novel. So we're going to have different interpretations, different readings, even though we read the same thing. That's normal. That's fine. But that does mean that there's some ambiguity. There's a lot more gray area when it comes to interpreting literature. There's not always a bunch of right answers and wrong answers. Now, some people will say there's no wrong answers when it comes to interpreting literature. I disagree. I think it is possible to be wrong. It is possible to be off base with your interpretation. And that happens from time to time. We can always make corrections. But there's never just one right answer. There's never just one correct interpretation. I don't think that's ever true. There's always a wide range of interpretations that could all be right for different people for different reasons. So keep that in mind. It's not, we're not doing math here. It's a more subjective activity. So that gives you more freedom, but in some ways, it also gives you a little bit more responsibility. So it's a good thing, but it can also be challenging. So, yeah, that's a big part of literary study is interpreting the literature that we read. But that's not all we're doing. We're also performing analysis at several different levels. And just in general, to analyze something means to take it apart, examine it, and figure out how it works. This is very much what we want to do with all of the works of literature that we encounter in this class. We want to take them apart and really examine each individual part that goes into that particular story, poem, whatever it is. And then we can sort of reassemble that piece of literature because we better understand its inner workings. We understand how all of those individual parts are working together to create a larger meaning. So doing interpretation is really inseparable from doing analysis because when we analyze, our end goal is to perform that kind of interpretive work where we can really uncover the meaning. So we can analyze a lot of different parts of a literary text. We can analyze characters, we can analyze the setting, we can analyze the plot, we can analyze theme, we can analyze language, we can analyze individual words or sentences or images or metaphors. There's really kind of limitless possibilities. It's really just dependent on what you find interesting. What do you want to explore further? Whatever it is, you can analyze it by digging deeper into the text. So we're going to learn some strategies and techniques for conducting that type of analysis. And a big part of that will include learning about different critical approaches. These are like different schools of literary criticism. And we're going to practice these different sort of critical approaches, and we're going to use a lot of them in our own writing to help us analyze and interpret literature. So, a lot of this class revolves around these critical approaches, and many of these have been around for a long time. These are just different ways of analyzing literature, but many of them borrow from other disciplines or they borrow from other like bodies of knowledge. So we're going to like some of these critical approaches, and then we're probably going to dislike some others. You're not going to necessarily want to use all of them all of the time. But by learning about several different critical approaches, we are just creating a body of knowledge. We are creating tool belts for ourselves. These are tools that we can use. We don't have to use all of them all of the time. We can pick and choose, but we're going to have options. We're going to have bodies of knowledge, and we're going to have specific tools that allow us to demonstrate that body of knowledge. That's really what the class is all about. We're just learning how to be better analyzers, but we're also acquiring the knowledge, the techniques, and the tools necessary to do that kind of work. So hopefully that makes sense. We can always talk more about it. We will talk more about it throughout the semester, but that's the basic gist of what we are doing in here. So once you have the book and you're able to check out that introductory chapter, you'll notice that they often talk about a sort of pre-critical or more emotional way of responding to literature. And they kind of start with that emotional, non critical, or pre critical way of responding. And they point out that that's a fine thing to do. Like, we want to eventually graduate to a more sophisticated, sort of critical apparatus that we can use to really work with literature. But as they point out in the book, we all have a sort of innate, natural ability to respond to what we read. And they also use the examples of like going to watch movies or, any type of artistic expression. We always respond to those art forms, whether we are reading something or watching something. We always have an immediate response. Always. And sometimes in English class, we're almost sort of taught to feel bad about emotions, or it's a sort of, we might almost feel like we're being told to ignore our initial pre-critical emotional response because it's not academic. It's not based on all of these things that we're going to be learning. So some students are like, oh, well, I'm not supposed to think of it that way. I'm not supposed to think of emotions. I'm not supposed to talk about how it made me feel or what it made me think about. But that's not the case. I don't want you guys to be afraid of the emotional response. That's a great place to start because it's natural. We all have one. So you don't have to manufacture it, it's already there. Whenever you read something for class, you're going to have an emotional response to it based largely on whether or not you liked it. So yeah, it's pretty simplistic, but it's a great place to start. It's not where we end, but it is where we start. So analyze your own emotional response. Why do you feel that way after reading the book or after watching the movie? What caused that emotional response? In other words, what did you like or what did you not like? That's a great place to start. Make a list. What were the parts of the movie or the book that really landed with you, that really connected with you, really made you feel something positive, or you had a moment of recognition? You could relate to what was happening on the screen or on the page. Those are important moments. You might want to write some of those down because you're going to revisit those. You might want to come back and talk more about those later on. Conversely, you can write down a few things that you didn't like. Why did the movie make you mad? Why did that particular character piss you off so much? What was it about that character or about that moment that made you feel that negative emotion? That can be a great place to start because there might be a lot that you can explore there by revisiting that particular scene or that particular character that just made you super angry. All right, so you can do it whether you're enjoying the text or you really didn't enjoy it. You still have an emotional response either way, whether it's positive or negative. So, yeah, a lot of those initial emotional responses come from the way we feel, but they're also heavily influenced by our own background, our own preferences, the stuff that we like, the stuff that we can relate to, and all of that's fine. It's highly personal, and we might not be able to use all of it later on when we start analyzing and interpreting in a more academic way, but it's all good info just for you to catalog and sort of work through. Why did I react that way? Why did I like this particular feature while I disliked this other one? Why was I able to relate to that character so well? Um, you know, go through all of that and come up with a few ideas. It's great to start with that initial emotional pre-critical response. But as they say in the book, eventually you want to graduate beyond that. You start with the emotions, the raw feelings that you have after consuming the literature. It's almost like a meal. How did that meal make you feel as it's digesting? Is it sitting well with you? Is it making you nauseous? Let's record those impressions. And once we've done that, we can move into a more analytical, nuanced, sophisticated approach. And that will include a lot of the stuff that we're going to be learning over the next, 12, 13 weeks, however many chapters we're covering. That's most weeks for us. So we're going to be tackling a new critical approach, practicing it, seeing if it works for us, and we'll eventually find the approaches that we really like, that work well for our style, and there might be some other approaches that we don't like as much. But the emotional response is the foundation. That's what we start with. And then we can add more as we get more advanced. And that's really what I'm here to help us with. So, one thing I wanted to point out about the book, you guys will notice this once you crack it open and start exploring a bit for yourself. But the way they've structured it, almost every chapter in the book covers a different critical approach. So, like formalism is one, feminism and gender studies is another, cultural studies, structuralism. These are all different critical approaches, and they all have chapters devoted to them. And the way the editors of the book have tried to sort of make all of this stuff clear to you is they keep working with 6 famous literary texts. And then for each chapter, they give you examples of how you could use a particular critical approach with those 6 texts. So, for example, chapter 3 is, is it chapter 2? One of these early chapters is about formalism. I do think it's chapter 3. Um, and at the end of that chapter, we don't have to know what formalism is yet. We'll learn soon. But at the end of that chapter, they do a formalist style analysis of all 6 of those texts that they're working with throughout the book. So those 6 works of literature are not in the book. The editors are assuming that you guys are already familiar with those 6 works of literature. So they're going to be using those works as examples in practically every chapter of the book. So that raises some interesting questions for us. Do we need to be familiar with all 6 of the examples that they're going to be using throughout the textbook? I would say no. Do we need to be familiar with some of those 6 works of literature that they're going to be using throughout the book? I would say yes to that question. So we don't have to know all of them, but I think it would be really helpful if you guys were familiar with at least a couple of these 6 famous literary texts that they are using. So let me just run through these 6 very quickly, and then I'll tell you what my plan is. Okay, we can't read them all. We don't have time for that, but I have a plan that I think will work. Here are the 6 works of literature that they keep using. You might have read some of these before. Everyday Use by Alice Walker. That's a short story. Hamlet, a very famous play, of course, by Shakespeare. Huckleberry Finn, a famous novel from the 19th century written by Mark Twain. To His Coy Mistress. That's a poem from a very long time ago written by Andrew Marvell. Young Goodman Brown, that's another short story written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, also from the 19th century. And then finally, Frankenstein, written in the early 19th century by Mary Shelley, a very famous novel that's been adapted into countless movies, TV shows, and other forms of media. I would like it very much if we could all read Frankenstein over the course of the first 2 weeks of the semester. Now, I have a little paperback copy here. I know I did not order any Frankenstein books for you guys. However, the good news is there's a lot of free versions online. So I found a free version of the novel available online, and I've already linked you guys to it in the week one module. So you can read the whole novel that way. Now, of course, you have to read it on your screen. It doesn't really look or feel the same as flipping through a paperback. So if you want an actual book, you can find used copies online for like a few bucks, honestly. That's not mandatory. You don't have to order a book, but if you want to, you're certainly free to do it. You can get something on your Kindle, whatever. You can read it online, buy an actual book, whatever works for you. But I would just like everybody to try to read the novel by the end of week two. It's not a very long novel. My copy here is only about 200 pages. The pagination might vary a little bit with different editions, different versions, but it's not that long. And the story is so familiar to us. I think you might find it a pretty enjoyable reading experience. The language is a little bit difficult. Mary Shelley was writing in the very beginning of the 1800s, so obviously the language is different from our language today. It's still modern English, believe it or not. Modern English has been around really since Shakespeare's time, but obviously the language has changed. It's different, it sounds different, the vocabulary is different, the syntax is different, but it's not a terribly difficult read. Once you get adjusted to Shelley's language, it's pretty action packed. A lot happens. And I think you guys might really enjoy it once you get into it. So just do your best. If it takes you a little bit longer than 2 weeks to read the whole thing, that's fine. If you want a little bit of support in the form of movies or other adaptations, I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think you should use a movie to replace the book. But if you're kind of struggling at times with the book, it might be helpful to watch one of the movies just to give you another lens to appreciate the story, give you another entry point, perhaps, and it might just clarify some of what's going on in the book. However, you guys want to do it. And if you've read Frankenstein before, that's great. Maybe you can just refresh your memory a little bit. But I would like everybody to read the book if you haven't already. And even if you have, it would still be nice to revisit it. And we're going to spend really the first 2 weeks doing that so we can have a base of knowledge when it comes to these different works of literature that they keep referring to in the book. So I want you guys to at least have Frankenstein under your belts. So when you're looking at examples of formalism, you can understand what they're doing with Frankenstein. When we're doing structuralism, you can understand that structuralist analysis of Frankenstein that they give you in the book. It's going to make sense to you because you've read the book. You know that particular work of literature. So if you know all 6 that they use, that would be great. But we really don't have time for that, like I said. So what I've done is I've made Frankenstein available and 2 other texts are available in the week 1 module. So I've given you a link to His Coy Mistress. That's a pretty short poem. I think everybody can read that here in week 1. So we can work with that in future chapters. And I've also linked you to Young Goodman Brown, the short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Once upon a time, that short story was commonly taught in high school. So if you went to a high school that still uses that curriculum, perhaps you've read Young Goodman Brown. It's a very famous sort of gothic horror story by Hawthorne. Very famous American short story. I'm not going to require you guys to read it. I would just recommend it. It's there. It's not very long. You have free access to it. It wouldn't hurt to knock out that short story either this week or next week. But I will require that everybody do their best with Frankenstein and also read the poem To His Coy Mistress because it's short. All right. And it's also free in the week one module. So if we can at least knock out Frankenstein and Marvell's poem, we'll have two of those texts kind of, taken care of, and we'll at least be able to use those examples when we get to them in the textbook chapters. So let's make two our minimum. If you can get to all six, if you can also read Everyday Use, Huck Finn, and Hamlet, I am very impressed. If you're able to do all of that, I'm super impressed. But do whatever is convenient for you beyond Frankenstein and beyond To His Coy Mistress. If you want to put on a movie version of Hamlet because you don't have time to read the play, that's fine. If you want to read like an abridged version of Huck Finn or just some excerpts, that's fine. Everyday Use is a pretty short, it's a short story. So that's going to be more manageable. I don't expect anybody to read all of Hamlet, but if you want to, you're certainly free to. But I will require Frankenstein and To His Coy Mistress. So if you're having any trouble accessing those two texts or you're, getting through them, just let me know. But I do think it's going to be helpful to have those texts filed away so we can better understand the textbook chapters. And you'll notice in the textbook, they don't have any works of literature. They're just giving you the critical apparatus to work with literature. So later in the semester, when we're writing our papers, we're going to have to choose our own works of literature to analyze. They don't really give you those in the book. But again, part of our learning process will involve these examples. And to follow those examples, you need to know Frankenstein and as many of those other texts as possible. So that's how we're going to do things week to week. So the first few weeks are going to be a little bit different. We're going to read Frankenstein, we're going to read Marvell's poem, and then by week 3, we're ready to actually jump into the textbook. All right? Well, we're jumping in here in week 1 with the first chapter. Okay, but that's quick. Won't take you long to read it, and then we'll spend some time with the actual works of literature. By week 3, we'll come back to the textbook and we'll jump into the pre-critical approaches. We'll learn a little bit more about how people analyze literature before literary criticism became an academic discipline and something that got taught and practiced consistently. So that's going to be a nice sort of preview. And we can use some of those pre-critical approaches. A lot of those are still fair game. And then by week 4, we're going to be ready to jump into formalism, which is the first major critical approach that they cover in the book. And really from week 4 all the way through about week 11, we're just covering a new critical approach each week with a couple of short breaks to write our critical response papers. And that's going to carry us through most of the semester. Once we're finished with cultural studies, our final chapter from the book, we're going to spend the rest of the semester really just focusing on our final paper. And that final paper will require you to use some of the critical approaches that we learn about, but you can apply them to any work of literature that you want. Something that you like, something that you read on your own, something that you want to talk more about. So we'll obviously spend plenty of time talking about that later. All right, so I hope that structure makes sense for you guys. Let's finish off the lecture by just talking a little bit more about literature. What is literature? It's one of those things that we kind of know it if we see it, but it can be a difficult thing to define. So let's go back once more to our previous experience with literature. I would like you guys to just take a moment right now. You can pause this video or stop it. You might need a break from me, and that's always an option with any of these lecture videos. You don't have to watch them all in a single sitting. So you might want to hit pause and just take a moment to write down some works of literature that you have read before, like classics, something like Frankenstein, something like Hamlet, What if you had to read before in previous classes? When you think of that word literature, what are some of the first examples that pop into your mind? And most people, yeah, it's the classics. They'll mention Hamlet, they'll mention Moby Dick, or something like Frankenstein. Famous books. Oftentimes, famous books that were written a long time ago and have been turned into movies and TV shows, and they're still taught in a lot of, K through 12 settings. So take a moment to just write down some titles that you can remember, things that you had to read for school. Take a moment to do that. And then you might want to do another list that consists of works of literature that you have read outside of school. So these will probably be more contemporary texts, things that were written more recently, but maybe not. Maybe you love 19th century literature. I don't know. Maybe you like to read a lot of that stuff for fun. But just jot down some titles of literary works that you've read or things that you think are literature. And different people have different definitions for what literature is. But you should notice by looking through your lists, that you have a pretty diverse group of works there. Not all literature is the same, right? And in fact, there are huge differences between different types of literature, different eras of literature. We're only going to scratch the surface of a lot of that stuff. But I would like us to think more about how we define literature. And normally, if you ask students, they'll basically say some variation of this answer: old books that I don't really like. That's how a lot of students think about literature. And again, I think our education system is partly to blame. Sometimes that's all you're really getting in K through 12. You're getting the Huck Finns, the Shakespeares, the Moby Dicks, and those can be difficult to read, right? They're old, they're hard to relate to, and like I was saying earlier, they're always packaged as assignments. It's work. It's not fun, right? It's work. You're responsible for having a good interpretation. You're responsible for getting a good score on the paper that you write about it. So a lot of the fun gets sucked out because it's work, because it's school, because the texts are difficult, and there's going to be a test at the end. So we're not always having a very good time. But literature is a lot more than that. Literature is, as I've said, a notoriously difficult word to define. So the classic definition would really break literature down into like three major groups. And many of these have been around for a really long time. So, like, the oldest forms of literature would often be considered to be poetry, drama, and epics. So you guys probably know, I mean, poetry and drama existed with ancient societies, right? Going back to places like ancient Greece or ancient Sumeria, right? They had these types of genres, right? They had epics as well. So epics are kind of a weird category for modern people to talk about. But you can think about like the Iliad or the Odyssey. So they were often composed in the form of poetry. They were written in verse, not prose. But they told these long narratives, so they're often considered to be kind of closer to a novel than a poem. But novels didn't exist really in the ancient world. Instead, they had epics, they had plays, and they had poems. So those are the three oldest genres or oldest types of literature. And they've been around really since the beginning, if not longer, than recorded history. Quite old. We've also developed some newer forms of literature in more recent centuries. So we often think of novels as the most common type of literature, and they probably are nowadays. But it might be interesting to consider that, at least in the English-speaking world, novels have really only been around since like the 1700s. Some might go back, some scholars would go back a little bit further and say maybe the 1600s, but not nearly as long as poetry or drama has been around. So novels are relatively new compared to those older forms of literature. We also have short stories. Those really developed in the 1800s in their modern form. So novels and short stories are the most popular types of prose literature. So just understand the basic difference between prose and verse. Prose is what you find in a novel or a short story or a comic book. It approximates the way people normally talk. Whereas verse does not. If you read a poem, it sounds different, right? Verse has different kinds of rules and different kinds of patterns on the level of rhyme scheme or meter or stanza. And you don't find that stuff typically in prose. So prose is usually thought of as a little bit easier to read. It's more realistic. It's more like we talk. Whereas poetry has kind of a different set of rules and it sounds very different because it's verse, whereas novels and short stories are prose. So just remember that. So those are the most common types of literature that we typically discuss: novels, short stories, poetry, but also plays, because even though plays are performed, they're also written. So we can read them in addition to watching them. So we still have plays and we still have epics, although they are much less common. So we can talk about all of those old categories of literature, but of course we live in the modern world. So we have more stuff now. And perhaps we can find a lot of newer categories of literature. Maybe we would consider graphic novels to be literature. Perhaps memoirs or autobiographies could be like literature. Maybe creative nonfiction, which is a relatively new category. Maybe we could consider that to be literature. So some people will say, well, if it's literature, it's got to be one of those major forms. It's got to be a novel or a short story or a poem or a play. But a lot of more contemporary folks disagree with that and say, no, it could be a movie. It could be a comic. It could be some kind of new multimedia form of expression that we don't even have a great name for. Some people would argue that almost any written text could be considered literature. Other people want to have more sort of sharp definitions and kind of more narrow categories. But typically, we can identify what we might call literary language or literary elements. So a lot of times, if we can find these certain types of elements, these certain kinds of language in a particular written text, we might go ahead and just consider that text to be literature no matter what it is. Maybe it's a newspaper article. Maybe it's something online. Maybe it's a graphic novel, but it has metaphors and characters and plots and all of these other literary elements that we would find in a novel or a short story. So if the text has those literary elements, we might be ready to call it a work of literature no matter what genre or type it belongs to. So that's an ongoing project for us, kind of deciding what we're going to classify as literature, and often we're making that decision based on where we're finding these literary elements. So let's run through these literary elements just a little bit. And again, this will be largely review for many of us because you've learned these elements, these concepts before. But I want us to have shared definitions that we can work with throughout the semester. All right. And these are some of our basic building blocks when it comes to literary analysis. These are some of the essential tools that we have to use when we are conducting analysis. And often these are going to be the things that we are analyzing. This is how we build an analysis, by picking different literary elements that we want to explore further, and by developing our ideas about those specific literary elements. So these are essential. You have to know these before we can start conducting analysis. So I wanted to give you guys these basic literary elements before we jumped into Frankenstein and those other works of literature that we're going to be referencing. So you're kind of ready to identify them in a novel or in a poem. Okay, so let's start with setting. And if you want to follow along in the book, this starts on page 6. So we can always be aware of the setting of a particular work of literature. Where are we? Where does that work of literature take place? So there's always a geographical setting that we should be aware of. Where in the world are we? Where do the events of this story take place? We can usually identify that. Sometimes authors might not give us a specific place, but we always learn a little bit about the setting. What is it like in this place? Is it cold? Is it hot? What are people wearing? We usually get some of those details, even if we don't have a lot of concrete specifics like a city or a state or a country. We can still learn a lot about the geographical setting. And also remember that there's such a thing as temporal setting. So it's not just a matter of where are we, it's also when are we? What time period are we in? Are we in the past? Have we gone back to the 1800s? Is that where the story is set? Have we moved to the future? Is it science fiction? Is it the year 2525? Or are we in the present day? Are we in the present moment? You can usually figure that out too. So the setting matters. The setting has a big impact on how we are going to interpret the story. And also, it has a big impact on how we're going to respond to the literature. A lot of times we enjoy particular stories because of the setting. We really enjoy going to this particular time period, learning more about it, or we really enjoy the world building that this particular author is doing in this fantasy, sci-fi, futuristic vision. So the setting matters. We can always kind of start there. Where are we and when are we? All right, start making some observations about that. Then we can move on to the plot. And I think most of us know what the plot is. It is the sequence of events in a narrative. So we're going to find that a lot of works of literature take a narrative form. A narrative just means a story. So most novels, most short stories, most plays, and even a lot of poems are telling stories. So we can often think of them that way. So any story has a plot. Some plots are full of really major, monumental events. Other plots might be filled with kind of mundane, typical, everyday events. Not everything has to be earth-shattering, but no matter what the story is, there's always going to be a plot. Things happen. So we, of course, have to keep track of what's happening. And we also want to keep track of the plot structure. Okay, how exactly are these events unfolding? What is the chronology? What is the sequence of the plot? Are we going in chronological order? That means from earliest to latest, from first to last? Or do we have a more mixed up chronology? Do we have flashbacks or flash forwards? Are we moving around in time and not necessarily following a straightforward linear path? You need to be aware of all of that. Also, if you look at page 7 in the book, they show you that classic plot pyramid or the plot triangle. A lot of you probably learned that at some earlier point in school. It's good to take a look at it and remember some of those terms. So we generally start with exposition. That's when the author is kind of setting the scene, providing some basic info to the reader about setting, about characters, kind of telling us basically what's going on in this time and place so we can get introduced to this new literary world. So there's usually exposition at the beginning of a narrative. But not always, but sometimes, oftentimes. So we usually start there, just like some basic explanatory material for the benefit of the reader. That's exposition. Then we move into rising action. So the plot is underway, things are happening, maybe there's some tension, there's conflict, and we don't quite know how it's all going to end up. So we keep climbing with that rising action, and then eventually we hit the climax, okay? And that's like the critical turning point when everything comes to a head and we have to sort of sort it out. Right? So the climax will usually happen kind of near the end, but not at the very end. Because after the climax, we have falling action. Things are kind of getting tied up and resolved, and then we usually wrap up with a conclusion, sometimes called a denouement, kind of how everything gets resolved at the very end. So that's typically like the classic plot structure. But you guys already know a lot of writers, a lot of TV shows and movies as well, they depart from that classic plot triangle. A lot of people don't really use that plot triangle in a super faithful way. Lots of plots are weird. Lots of plots will start without any exposition. And lots of plots might not have much resolution at the end after the climax. We might kind of have an open-ended ending or a cliffhanger. Things are ambiguous. So I don't want you to get too tied up in plot. Plot, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many lit scholars, doesn't matter as much as other elements. It matters, and you can do a lot of interesting work with it, but don't get hung up on, well, this plot doesn't really have falling action, so I don't know. That's fine, right? Plots don't have to follow those rules, but many of them do. So keep that in mind. Characters, we know what characters are. These are the people that inhabit the narrative. These are the people that we are learning about, reading about, spending time with. Sometimes they're telling the story themselves. Other times we are observing them more from a distance. Sometimes one of the characters will be our narrator. Other times, the narrator might be more of a third-person, omniscient narrator who's a little bit more separate from the action. So there's lots of different kinds of characters. Usually, we consider the main character to be the protagonist, and then whoever is opposed to the protagonist is the antagonist. But we know lots of stories are complex. Protagonists are not always heroes, and antagonists are not always villains. Okay? A protagonist just means it's the main character. It's the person that we are spending the most time with. They don't necessarily have to be heroic. And an antagonist might not be a villain. They're just opposed to the protagonist in some way. They are providing obstacles for the protagonist. They are standing in the way of the protagonist accomplishing whatever it is that the protagonist wants to accomplish. So it's not always as simple as good versus evil. Sometimes it might be in certain narratives and certain works of literature. It is that simple. But in other cases, there's going to be a lot more gray area. So we can always analyze individual characters, and we can always do a lot with them. And we often form really strong attachments to characters, right? Thinking about those initial emotional responses, they're frequently driven by how we feel about characters. Oh, I hate that guy. Or I really like this character. I can really relate to her. I can really understand what she's going through. Her experiences really speak to me. But that other guy, I can't stand that guy, right? It's good to have those feelings, and you can build on those. All right. Next up is structure. I've already talked about structure a little bit as it pertains to plot. So you can always analyze the structure of a plot. Again, how do the events unfold? But you can also think more about different forms and formulas that might be at work in a particular work of literature. So, one of the examples they give, I think, in the book is horror movies. If you're analyzing a horror movie, you might want to think about how the plot is constructed, but you also might want to think about certain character prototypes or atmosphere. All of that contributes to the structure of the overall movie. If you're watching a crime thriller, you're definitely examining the plot, but you're interested probably in some non-linear features of that plot, like flashbacks or, you know, some kind of other distorted chronology. But if we're looking at the structure of a poem, a lot of poems don't have as clear of a plot. So some do. But we might move away from plot a little bit if we're thinking about the structure of a poem, and we'll think more about stanzas, or we'll think more about rhyme scheme, or we'll think about the meter that the poem is written in. These are all like formulas and forms that are kind of more unique to poetry, and they have a big impact on the structure of a given poem. So, depending on what we're analyzing, we can focus on different parts of structure. If we're analyzing a movie or a novel, most of our structure work will be based on the plot. But if we're looking at a poem or maybe a play, the way we examine structure can be quite different. But we're always interested in structure. It's always a rich area to explore if you want to conduct analysis. The next one they have in the book is style, another concept that's hard to define. But just remember, every writer has their own style. Every TV show, every movie, every novel, every short story has its own unique style. And often, if you get familiar with a particular author or a particular showrunner or movie director, you'll get familiar with their personal style, because a lot of these artists have their own styles that show up in a lot of their work. So some might have a super realistic style that really mirrors everyday life. Other styles might be over the top, gory, violent, maybe funny, lighthearted, witty. It's up to you to really figure out what the style is, how you feel about that style, and what more we can say about it. But identifying the style is always good work to do, and you can always do that with anything you're reading. And then we have atmosphere. That's just like the mood or the feeling that permeates an environment. So every work of literature has its own atmosphere. If we're reading a gothic horror story, there's going to be scary, haunted castles, stormy nights, right? Because they're trying to establish a gloomy, spooky mood. But if we're reading something that's supposed to be funny or lighthearted or uplifting, it's going to have a very different atmosphere. So many different aspects of a work of literature can contribute to the atmosphere. The setting can definitely contribute to it. The plot, a lot of these other elements can contribute directly to atmosphere. The characters and what they're doing, the actual story, but also things that the author is clearly doing on the level of individual words or sentences. So like word choice, diction, syntax, how the sentences are arranged. All of that will contribute to atmosphere, and also the unique style of that author or that work of literature will also contribute to the overall atmosphere. Another thing to observe, to come up with ideas about, and if you're interested, you can do a lot with atmosphere for almost any work of lit. And then finally, theme. That's the overall meaning or underlying idea of a text. So we always want to kind of finish our work by identifying the theme. This is where a lot of the interpretive work, a lot of the interpretation happens at the level of theme. What is the message that the text is trying to get across? Right? What is the overall message or meaning? We always want to know that. But remember, the theme is a good destination. It's not where you start. It's often where you end up. A lot of students want to jump right to the theme, and that's all they want to do because it's easy to find the theme, right? This story is all about the difficulties of getting older and recognizing your own mortality and blah blah blah. We can find that answer online for any work of literature that we are assigned. We can find the theme for Frankenstein, for any of these other texts in a matter of moments. So it's fine to talk about theme, but that's not the end all be all for us. That's just one element of many. And yes, it's a good place to end up, but to really talk about theme, you have to cover a lot of these other elements first. Because if you really want to talk about theme, you can't just tell us what the text means. Like, yeah, we can all Google that. You have to show us how the text expresses meaning through character or plot or setting or all of these other elements that we just mentioned. So that's really what we want. We're not ignoring theme, but the theme really needs to be the end result of all of this other work that you've already done. And the final move that you make is to uncover the theme. All right. And just a final thought. Remember, some people confuse the theme with what happens in the plot or the subject matter. But that's not right. The theme is not what the text is about. It's not what happens in the text. It's what the text says or means. So it's not just, oh, it's about war. Yes, that's the subject matter. But the movie is saying something about war. Okay? Or like love. The book's theme isn't love, it's about a love story, but it's saying something about that love story. It has a meaning, it has a message, and we have to interpret it and make it easy for our readers to understand. That's part of our job. And my final thought for this first lecture is you can't use AI to do a lot of this kind of analytical, interpretive work. We'll talk more next week about some of the ways that we can use AI to help us learn more about the literature that we're reading, to help us learn more about the critical approaches that we're going to apply to the works of literature. So I'm not banning AI in this class. You can use it for certain things, but when it comes to writing literary analysis, only humans can do that. So we'll talk more about that next week. Get in touch if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll see you in week 2.